What would you do if the world cast you out with nothing but the clothes on your back and $3 to your name? What if your only hope for shelter was a place everyone else had dismissed as worthless, a forgotten ruin on a desolate coast? This is the story of Vesta Pryor, a young woman of 19 who, in the year 1881, paid the sum of $3 for a deed to a dead lighthouse, a stone tower standing not on the sea, but a mile inland on a cliff overlooking a dry, rock-strewn bight where the ocean had retreated decades before. They called it a folly, a tombstone, a joke. But the truth waiting inside its silent, spiraling dark would not only change her life, but rewrite the history of the entire coast. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from, as we tell the story of the girl who bought a lighthouse on the dry coast. The dust of the road from the Finch farm was a second skin on Vesta Pryor. It coated her worn calico dress, filled the creases of her chapped hands, and settled in a fine, gritty layer on her eyelashes. She had walked for 2 days, sleeping one night in the hollow of a great oak, her only possession a small, battered valise clutched in one hand. Inside were a change of underthings, a comb, a bar of lye soap, her father's old pry bar wrapped in oilcloth, and the $3 she had earned and saved from her mending work. It was everything she had. The memory of Mrs. Finch's face, tight with disappointment and fury, was a fresh brand. The woman's son had offered marriage, and Vesta, knowing his changeable heart and entitled hands, had quietly refused. For a hired girl, a foundling with no family to speak of, it was an unforgivable insult. She was told to be gone by morning, and so she was. She arrived in the town of Port Blossom on the 3rd day, a place that smelled more of dust and cattle than the salt it once had. The port had dried up years ago when the coastline shifted, leaving the town landlocked and resentful, a ship run aground. The people she passed on the plank sidewalks looked through her, another piece of drifting humanity washed up on their shores. Their gazes were flat, incurious. She was just a girl, thin and tired and forgotten before she was ever known. Her plan, if it could be called that, was simple and desperate. Find work, any work, before the $3 were gone. But as she passed the dusty window of the Territorial Land Office, a notice tacked to the glass caught her eye. It was written in a fading, spidery script on sun-yellowed paper. For sale by county mandate. 1 decommissioned lighthouse property. Lot 7, Blackwood Point. As is, inquire within. Her only true friend in the world had been Jebediah Stone, the son of the blacksmith who'd employed her father before he passed. Jeb was older, steadier, a man who spoke little but saw much. Before she'd been sent to the Finch farm, he'd sometimes share an apple with her by the forge, the heat of the fire a comforting presence. On a desperate whim, she found him at the livery stable, his hands gentle as he reshod a nervous mare. He looked at her, took in the dust and the exhaustion in a single, quiet glance, and didn't ask the questions she couldn't answer. He just nodded slowly. "Heard you left the Finches," he said, his voice low. "I did," she replied. "Where you headed?" "I don't know yet." She hesitated, the words feeling foolish before she even spoke them. "I saw a notice. For the old lighthouse." Jeb stopped his work, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "That old thing? Vesta? It's a ruin. A mile from the water. They say the keeper went mad in it." "It's stone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It would be shelter." He saw the resolve in her eyes, the sheer cliff edge of her circumstance. He didn't argue. He didn't pity her. He simply offered the only thing he could. "You'll need a way to get there. And supplies. My father's old wagon is in the back. And the old gelding Atlas. He's slow, but he's strong. You can take them. Pay me back when you can." The kindness was so unexpected it almost broke her. She just nodded, unable to speak. The weight of his trust was heavier than her valise, and more precious than the $3 she was about to spend on a ghost. The man in the land office, a portly fellow named Marcus Thorne with a watch chain stretched tight across his vest, laughed when she told him what she wanted. It was not a kind laugh. It was a sound of pure, dismissive contempt. The old lighthouse. Girl, are you touched in the head? That's not a property, it's a pile of rocks, a tombstone for a dead coastline. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. The county's been trying to unload it for 20 years. It's on the books for back taxes nobody will ever pay. The deed ain't worth the paper it's printed on. Vesta stood before his desk, her hands clasped tight in front of her. She did not flinch. She just waited. How much? She asked. Thorne sized her up, his eyes lingering on her worn dress and the desperate set of her jaw. He saw a fool, an easy mark for his own amusement. Tell you what, he said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. You give me $3 for the filing fee to clear the tax lien, and the deed is yours. $3 for your very own stone folly on the edge of nowhere. He chuckled again, shaking his head. You'll be the talk of the town. She didn't hesitate. She reached into her pocket and placed her $3 on his desk. The coins made a soft, final sound on the wood. Solid. Real. Thorne's smile faltered for a second, surprised by her swiftness. He shrugged, took the money, and began to fill out the paperwork with a flourish, as if officiating a grand joke. He pulled a long, yellowed scroll of paper from a dusty cubbyhole. The deed. He scrawled her name, Vesta Pryor, in the blank space, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. He didn't bother to blow the ink dry before folding it and pushing it across the desk toward her. There you have it, Miss Pryor, he said, his voice dripping with mock formality. You are now the proud owner of the most useless piece of real estate in California. Good luck to you. Vesta took the deed. The paper was cool and heavy in her hand. It felt less like a document of ownership and more like a map to the end of the world, or the beginning of one. She didn't know which. It was shelter. It was a place to be, a place that was hers, even if it was a ruin. For a girl who had nothing and was owned by no one, the distinction was everything. She folded the paper, placed it in her valise, and walked out of the office without another word, the sound of Thorne's laughter following her into the dusty street. She had a horse to find, a wagon to load, and a lighthouse to claim. What secret could a dead lighthouse hold a mile from the sea? Was it truly just a pile of stones, a monument to a forgotten past? Or did its silent, spiraling staircase lead to something more? Let us know what you think Vesta will find in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of incredible discoveries in the most unlikely of places. But as she held the deed, a piece of paper bought with the last of her money, Vesta Pryor couldn't know that she had just purchased not just a home, but a key to a dark and buried secret that had been waiting for half a century to be brought into the light. True to his word, Marcus Thorne made Vesta the talk of the town. As she went to the general store to spend the small amount of credit Jeb had arranged for her, the whispers followed her down the aisles. She could feel the eyes on her back as she selected flour, salt, beans, a small sack of coffee, and a box of matches. The storekeeper, a man with a thin mustache and nervous eyes, treated her with a kind of pitying curiosity. All this for a trip out to the old light? He asked, weighing the beans. Ain't nobody been out there in years. Not since old Cain, the keeper, was found at the bottom of the cliff. Vesta just nodded, offering no explanation. Her silence was a wall they couldn't breach, and it seemed to frustrate them, turning their curiosity to open mockery. A pair of ranchers leaning by the door snickered as she passed. That's her, one muttered, loud enough for her to hear. The girl who bought the tombstone? The other one spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. More money than sense, that one. She kept her eyes forward, her face a placid mask, but the words were like small, sharp stones pelting her. As she loaded her meager supplies into the back of the old wagon, an old man approached her. He was impossibly weathered, his face a roadmap of sun and sea and time. He smelled of salt, though the ocean was a distant memory. He moved slowly, leaning on a piece of driftwood worn smooth as bone. He stopped beside her, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky. He looked from her to the gentle old horse, Atlas, then up toward the distant, unseen point of land where the lighthouse stood. The townspeople gave him a wide berth, as if he were a ghost himself. "You're the girl," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underwater. It wasn't a question. "I am," Vesta said. The old man, who she would later learn was Silas Blackwood, the last of the old dory fishermen, stared at her for a long, unnerving moment. His gaze was heavy, freighted with a knowledge she couldn't comprehend. "Some lights ain't meant to guide ships," he said, his voice spare and formal. "Some are meant to guide souls. Just be sure which one you're tending." Before she could ask what he meant, he turned and shuffled away, leaving her standing in the swirling dust. The cryptic words hung in the air, a strange and unsettling blessing, or perhaps a warning. A moment later, Marcus Thorne stepped out of the land office, spotting her by the wagon. He strode over, a wide, superior grin on his face. "Well, well, Prior's Folly about to set sail," he boomed, gesturing to her wagon. "Stocking the larder for your grand estate? Don't let the ghosts eat all your beans." He laughed his booming, unpleasant laugh, and the ranchers joined in. Vesta simply finished securing the last of her things, checked the harness on Atlas, and climbed onto the wagon seat. She picked up the reins, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't look at Thorne. She didn't look at any of them. She just clucked her tongue, and the old horse leaned into his harness, pulling the wagon slowly forward, away from the laughter and the whispers, away from the town, and toward the unknown. The old fisherman's words echoed in her mind, a riddle she had no way of solving. The journey from Port Blossom to Blackwood Point was a slow passage from one world to another. The town's dusty streets gave way to a rutted track that wound through parched cattle lands. The grass was the color of old straw, and the heat shimmered above the cracked earth. Atlas moved at a steady, unhurried pace, his hooves kicking up small puffs of alkaline dust. Vesta sat straight on the wagon seat, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The farther she got from the town, the more the tightness in her chest began to ease. Here, there were no whispers, no mocking smiles. There was only the vast, indifferent sky, the cry of a lone hawk circling overhead, and the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels. The land grew harsher, stonier. The sparse oaks gave way to scrubby, wind-bent cypress and manzanita. The air began to change, losing the scent of dust and manure and taking on a faint, briny tang, a ghost of the sea. After several hours, she saw it. It rose from a high, barren promontory of dark rock, a stark white finger pointing at the sky. The lighthouse. From this distance, it didn't look like a ruin. It looked stark, lonely, but solid, unbreakable. A flicker of something like hope stirred in her. As the wagon drew closer, however, the illusion of strength began to crumble. She could see the details, the pockmarked stone, the dark stains of rust bleeding down from the ironwork of the gallery, the gaping glassless holes of the lower windows. The lantern room at the very top was a dark, empty socket. It stood on a wide, flat shelf of rock about 50 yards from the edge of a sheer cliff. Below the cliff was not the sea, but a brutal landscape of shattered boulders and sun-bleached rock, the ancient, dry seabed. The path ended at the base of the tower. Vesta pulled Atlas to a halt. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the broken windows and the distant sigh of the actual ocean, now a mile away. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long, distorted shadows. The air was cool and carried a damp chill. The place felt profoundly empty, abandoned by man and God and even the sea itself. It was more desolate than she could have imagined. Jeb's words came back to her. It's a ruin. The town's laughter echoed in her ears. For a moment, a wave of despair so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. What had she done? She had traded everything for a pile of stones and ghosts. She slid down from the wagon seat, her legs unsteady. She walked toward the tower, her hand outstretched, and laid her palm flat against the cold stone. It was rough, gritty, but solid. Real. This was hers. That night, she didn't go inside. The darkness in the gaping doorway felt too absolute. Instead, she unhitched Atlas, watered him from her barrel, and let him graze on the sparse, salty weeds growing in the cracks of the rock. She built a small fire from driftwood she gathered along the cliff edge and ate a supper of cold beans and a piece of hard bread. She spread her bedroll on the ground near the wagon, the silent, looming tower her only companion. She lay there for hours, watching the stars blaze to life in the black, moonless sky, more brilliant than she had ever seen them. The wind moaned around the tower, a low, mournful song. It sounded like a voice trying to tell a long-forgotten story. Sometime before dawn, she fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, the key to the heavy iron-banded door clutched in her hand. The next morning, under the clear, pale light of a new day, she would step across the threshold and begin her new life. She rose with the sun, her resolve hardened by the cold night air. She approached the door, fitted the great iron key into the lock, and turned. The mechanism groaned, a sound of deep rust and long disuse. With a final, shuddering clank, the bolt slid back. Vesta pushed, and the heavy door swung inward on protesting hinges, opening into a deep, circular darkness. Taking a deep breath, Vesta stepped inside. The air was thick and cold, smelling of damp stone, salt, and the dry, papery scent of decay. A faint, greenish light filtered down from the upper levels, illuminating a circular stone chamber. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, sand, and the tiny bones of birds and rodents that had found their way in and never found their way out. In the center of the room, a magnificent spiral staircase of cast iron, its surface a filigree of rust, wound its way up into the darkness. It was the lighthouse's spine. Everything else was empty. There was no furniture, no sign that anyone had lived here for a very long time. It was as Thorne had said, a tomb. But it was a tomb with a roof and walls that could keep out the wind. That was more than she'd had the night before. She spent the first days in a fever of labor. She swept the floors, starting from the top and working her way down, pushing decades of dust and debris out the door. She used old sacks she found in the wagon to block the broken lower windows, shutting out the constant, whistling wind. She hauled water from her barrel, scrubbed the grime from the stone walls, and established a small living space for herself on the ground floor. She set up a makeshift cot, a small table from an old crate, and a place for a small stove she planned to buy if she ever had money again. Atlas became her silent, steady companion. He would stand just outside the open door, his head lowered, occasionally letting out a soft huff as if to check on her. In the evenings, she would sit with him, sharing a piece of an apple, and watch the sun set over the dry bite, the rocks below turning from gray to gold to purple in the fading light. The lighthouse was 5 levels high. Each level was a single, circular room, identical to the one below it, all connected by the spiraling stair. They were all empty. As she worked her way up, cleaning each floor, a sense of the lighthouse's soul began to settle into her. She felt the immense solitude of the place, the deep, abiding quiet. She thought of the keeper, the man the storekeeper had called Cain, living here alone, year after year, his only company, the turning of the light and the sound of the sea. She wondered about his madness, about his fall from the cliff. Was it the solitude that had broken him, or something else? Finally, after a week of hard labor, she reached the top, the lamp room. This was the heart of the lighthouse, the reason for its existence. It was smaller than the rooms below, a cage of glass and iron. Most of the thick glass panes were shattered, and the wind moved freely through the space. In the center of the room stood the pedestal where the great Fresnel lens would have once sat. The lens was long gone, sold for scrap decades ago, no doubt. The pedestal was just a heavy iron base bolted to the floor. The room was empty, stripped bare. It was a profound disappointment. She had hoped for something, some small remnant of the light, a piece of brass, a spare wick, anything, but there was nothing, just dust, broken glass, and the endless, empty sky. She began the task of sweeping the broken glass and accumulated grime from the floor. The work was methodical, calming. She focused on the feel of the broom in her hands, the scrape of the bristles on the iron floor. As she worked her way around the central pedestal, her broom nudged against the curved stone wall, and that's when she noticed it. A small detail, something that refused to fit. The lighthouse was a perfect cylinder, each stone cut and placed to create a seamless curve. But here, for a stretch of about 6 feet behind the lantern's pedestal, the curve wasn't perfect. It was subtly, almost imperceptibly, flattened. The mortar between these stones was a slightly different shade, a paler gray, and the texture was smoother, less weathered than the surrounding wall. It was a patch, a careful one, meant to blend in, but a patch nonetheless. Someone had altered this wall. She stopped sweeping, her heart giving a sudden, sharp thump. She ran her hand over the stones. They felt different, colder, smoother. Why would anyone repair a wall from the inside, and so high up? She stared at the flat section of the wall, a deep, unnameable suspicion beginning to form in the back of her mind. For several days, Vesta did nothing about the wall. The discovery sat in her mind like a stone in her shoe, a persistent, low-grade irritant she tried to ignore. She had more pressing concerns. Her supply of flour was dwindling, and the nights were growing colder. Survival was a full-time occupation. She spent her days gathering driftwood for her fire, mending her one spare dress, and making the ground floor of the lighthouse as much of a home as she could. She even found a small, protected crevice in the rock face where a bit of soil had collected, and she planted the handful of bean seeds she had saved, watering them sparingly from her precious barrel. It was a foolish act of hope, planting seeds in stone, but it made her feel rooted to the place. Yet every time she climbed the spiral stairs to watch the sunset from the lamp room, her eyes were drawn to that flat section of wall. It was a question mark made of stone and mortar. Her father had been a stonemason, and she had spent her childhood at his side watching him work. She remembered the smell of wet lime and sand, the sharp ring of his hammer on chisel, the patient way he would fit one stone against another. A memory surfaced, clear and sharp, her father showing her how to spot a weak seam in an old wall. "Look for the new work," he had told her, his voice a warm rumble. "Time tells on everything, Vesta. The new work always tries to hide, but the stone always remembers." She remembered running her small hand over a patch he'd made in a church wall, the mortar still soft, and how he'd shown her the subtle difference in color and texture. Now, standing in the lamp room, she saw her father's lesson laid out before her. This was new work. Decades old, perhaps, but newer than the rest of the tower. The next morning, She brought her broom and a bucket of water to the lamp room. She wasn't ready to break anything yet. She was still investigating. She began to clean the wall with a damp rag, scrubbing away the years of grime. As the dirt came away, the difference became more pronounced. The mortar lines in the flattened section were finer, more precise than the slightly thicker, more weathered lines around them. As she knelt to wipe down the base of the wall, her fingers brushed against the floor. The dust here was different. It wasn't the gritty mix of sand and stone dust that covered the rest of the floor. It was a fine, almost silky white powder, plaster dust. She looked from the dust on her fingers to the wall. There was no plaster anywhere else in the lighthouse. It was all stone and iron. She stood up and tapped the wall with her knuckles. The original curved sections of the tower answered with a dull, solid thud. Stone. When she tapped the flat section, the sound was different. It was still solid, but there was a subtle hollowness to it, a deadened quality. Her heart began to beat faster. She pressed her ear against the stones, listening. Nothing. Just silence. But it was a different kind of silence. A contained silence. She pulled the small, heavy pry bar from her valise. It felt cold and purposeful in her hand. That evening, as twilight bled across the sky, she lit her lantern and carried it up the 138 iron steps to the lamp room. The wind howled outside the broken glass, but inside, Vesta felt a strange calm. She was no longer afraid of the ghosts. She was about to ask them a question. She wedged the tip of the pry bar into one of the fine mortar lines and leaned her weight against it. There was a faint, grating sound, and a small piece of mortar crumbled away, revealing not more stone behind it, but a sliver of dark, dry wood. The discovery of the wood behind the mortar changed everything. The work was no longer about suspicion, it was about revelation. Vesta worked with a quiet, focused intensity. Using the pry bar and the heel of her hand, she began to chip away at the mortar seams of the flattened wall. The stones were a facade, thin slabs of rock mortared over a wooden frame. They came away with a dry, scraping sound, revealing the dark, weathered planks beneath. It was a false wall, built with incredible care and patience, designed to look like the rest of the tower to a casual observer. Who would ever look this closely at a wall in the highest room of an abandoned lighthouse? Only someone who lived there. Only someone who was cleaning every inch of it, making it her own. After an hour of labor, she had exposed the entire wooden section. It was a simple plank wall, the boards fitted tightly together, covering an area about 6 feet wide and 8 feet high. There was no knob, no handle, no visible hinge. She ran her hands over the surface, searching for a seam, a latch. Nothing. She pushed against it. The wall was solid, unmoving. Stepping back, she held the lantern high, studying the construction. The planks were held in place by something from behind. There was only one way through. With a deep breath, she positioned the tip of the pry bar between two of the central planks and pushed. The old wood groaned in protest. She put her shoulder into it, leveraging her full weight. With a loud crack, the wood splintered. A sliver of profound darkness appeared. An odor wafted out, an ancient, dead smell of dry rot, stagnant air, and something else. Something metallic and faintly greasy, like old coins. It was the smell of something sealed away for a very long time. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the howling of the wind. She worked the pry bar back and forth, widening the gap. The wood was brittle, and soon she had broken away a large enough section to see inside. She thrust the lantern into the opening. The light fell upon a small, hidden chamber, a secret closet built into the thick stone of the tower wall. And it was not empty. The first thing she saw was a series of dull, heavy-looking bars stacked neatly against the back wall. They were dark, almost black with tarnish, but where the lantern light caught an edge, they gave off a soft, unmistakable gleam. Gold. Stacked beside them were several canvas sacks, slumped and heavy, the unmistakable round shapes of coins pressing against the fabric. On a small, rough-hewn shelf above the gold sat a collection of tarnished silver objects: a chalice, a candlestick, a heavy chain, and several leather pouches that looked to be filled with jewelry. It was a pirate's hoard, hidden in the top of a lighthouse. But it was the object on the very top of the shelf that made her breath catch in her throat. It was a book, a thick ledger bound in dark leather, its cover warped and stiff. It was wrapped in a sheath of oilcloth, a sign that its owner had meant for it to survive. This, she knew with a chilling certainty, was more important than all the gold. This was the story. Trembling, she reached into the dark space and lifted the book down. She unwrapped the oilcloth. On the first page, written in a cramped, angry script, were the words, "Logbook and accounts of Silas Kane. Keeper, Blackwood Point Light, 1845 to 1851. She sank to the floor, the heavy book in her lap, and opened it. The lantern light flickered across the page, and she began to read. The first entries were normal. Weather observations, notes on lamp maintenance, ships sighted. But then, about 6 months in, the tone began to change. October 12th, 1845. Heavy fog. The Mary Ann, out of Boston, trimmed the light to show a passage north of the reef. She found the rocks south of it. Salvage was good. A cold dread washed over Vesta. She read on, her horror growing with every entry. December 3rd, 1845. Storm from the northwest. The sea serpent, a rich one carrying silks and silver, hung a second, false light from the lower gallery to draw her in. She broke her back on the dragon's teeth. The waves did the work. God forgive me, the pay is too good. It was a confession, a meticulous, detailed record of a wrecker. Silas Kane hadn't just tended the light. He had weaponized it, using it to lure ships to their doom on the rocks below, then scavenging the wreckage for treasure. This wasn't a fortune. It was a grave marker for dozens of sailors, a hoard of stolen lives. She finally understood the storekeeper's words. Kane hadn't just fallen from the cliff. He had likely been pushed, or had jumped, unable to live with what he had done. She closed the book, the weight of its secrets pressing down on her. The gold in the wall was no longer a treasure. It was an accusation. For 2 days, Vesta did not touch the gold. She left the broken wall open, a gaping wound in the lamp room, a constant reminder of the dark truth she had uncovered. The logbook sat on her small crate table, its presence filling the small space with a heavy, silent judgment. She felt like a trespasser, a ghost haunting another ghost's crime scene. The gold was a curse. Every ingot, every coin was stained with the salt of drowned men. To spend it would be to become an accomplice to Silas Kane's sins. But to leave it there felt wrong, too. The secret needed air. The story needed to be told. She was torn, caught between the desperate poverty that had driven her here and the terrible moral weight of her discovery. She felt more alone than ever. On the third night, the storm came. It blew in from the northwest, the same direction as the storm that had wrecked the sea serpent. The sky turned a bruised, malevolent purple, and the wind, which had been her constant companion, rose to a furious, screaming howl. It shrieked through the broken panes of the lamp room and rattled the makeshift coverings on the lower windows. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets that hammered against the stone tower. Atlas, who she had brought inside, stood nervously in the center of the ground floor, his ears twitching at every fresh onslaught. Vesta sat by her small fire, the logbook open in her lap, listening to the storm and thinking of the ships that had met their end on this coast, betrayed by the very light that was meant to save them. It was then that she heard it. A sound that was not the wind. A desperate human shout, nearly swallowed by the gale. She rushed to the door, peering out into the maelstrom. In the flashes of lightning that illuminated the ravaged landscape, she saw them. A family, a man, a woman, and a small child, huddled beside a wagon with a shattered wheel, not 200 yards from the lighthouse. They were travelers, caught on the old coastal track by the sudden storm. The man was trying to hold a panicked horse while the woman shielded the child with her body. They were going to perish out there. In that moment, her paralysis broke. The choice became starkly, terrifyingly clear. She could stay inside, guarding a dead man's cursed gold, or she could make the lighthouse what it was always supposed to be, a shelter, a beacon. Without a second thought, she grabbed her lantern, pulled her thin shawl over her head, and plunged out into the storm. The wind tore at her, the rain blinding her, but she fought her way toward them, a small, determined figure against the immense fury of the elements. "Here!" she yelled, her voice thin against the roar. "Shelter! This way!" She helped the man, whose name was Miller, unhitch his terrified horse and lead it to the relative safety of the tower's lee side. She guided his wife and their feverish little girl inside, into the warm, dry space by the fire. Mrs. Miller was weeping with gratitude and relief. Vesta gave them her blanket, made them hot coffee, and used her own meager medical knowledge to tend to the child's fever. As the storm raged at its peak, an idea took hold of her. She took her own simple lantern, the one that had lit her reading of the logbook, and climbed the 138 steps to the lamp room. Standing there amidst the howl of the wind, she placed the lantern on the central pedestal. Its small, steady flame, a tiny point of light in the vast, violent darkness. It wasn't a Fresnel lens. It wasn't a lie. It was just a light, a promise, a welcome. Down below, a family was safe. The curse was being broken. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. The Miller family, safe and warm, looked at Vesta with a kind of stunned reverence. Their daughter's fever had broken, and she was sleeping peacefully wrapped in Vesta's blanket. Mr. Miller, a plain-spoken farmer, wrung her hand, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us," he said simply. "We saw your light. We thought we were done for." Vesta just shook her head, a strange lightness filling her. She had done nothing but open her door. Later that day, after Mr. Miller had managed to mend his wagon wheel well enough for travel, the family departed, promising to send word and payment for her help. Vesta asked for nothing, but they insisted. As their wagon trundled away, she knew that the story of their rescue would travel with them. The secret of the lighthouse was no longer just hers. 2 days later, a rider arrived from Port Blossom. It was not Mr. Miller. It was the county clerk, a tidy, serious man named Abernathy. Mr. Miller had not only told the story of his rescue, but had also, in his gratitude, spoken of the strange, fierce girl living alone in the ruin. A girl who deserved the community's help. Intrigued, Abernathy had come to see for himself. Vesta did not know what to do. But looking at his calm, professional face, she made a decision. She invited him in, gave him a cup of coffee, and then, without a word, she laid the logbook on the table before him. Mr. Abernathy, a man accustomed to deeds and ledgers, picked it up. He read for nearly an hour, his expression growing more grim with each page he turned. When he was finished, he closed the book gently and looked at Vesta. "My God," he whispered. He followed her up the winding stairs to the lamp room and stared into the dark, hidden chamber at the stacks of gold and silver. He touched one of the ingots, then pulled his hand back as if it were hot. "This changes the historical record," he said, his voice full of awe. "The wrecks. We always thought they were just bad luck. Storms. This is murder and piracy." He looked at Vesta, his eyes full of a new respect. "What you have found here, Miss Pryor, is not just treasure. It is evidence. It belongs to the archives. The gold, legally it's unclaimed salvage, and since you own the property where it was found, and you were the one to find it, it is yours. Just then, another wagon rattled up the track. It was Marcus Thorne, his face red with exertion and curiosity, no doubt drawn by the news spreading through town of the clerk's official visit to Prior's Folly. He strode toward the lighthouse, a smug look on his face, ready to witness some new chapter of her foolishness. He stopped dead in the doorway, taking in the scene. Vesta, standing calm and composed. The county clerk, his face grave and important. And on the table between them, the open logbook and a single heavy gold ingot Abernathy had brought down. Thorne's jaw fell open. He looked from the gold to Vesta, his contemptuous smile melting into a mask of pure, dumbfounded disbelief. The town's joke had become its most important citizen overnight. He said nothing. He simply turned, climbed back into his wagon, and rattled away, a man defeated by a truth far stranger than any fiction he could have concocted. The laughter had finally stopped. The news of Vesta's discovery spread like a brushfire. Within a week, Port Blossom was buzzing not with ridicule, but with a hushed, reverent awe. The story grew with each telling. The lone girl in the abandoned lighthouse, the terrible storm, the rescued family, the hidden wall, the wrecker's gold, and the dark secret of the town's own history. Reporters arrived from San Francisco, their notebooks filling with the incredible tale. Geologists and historians came to study the shifted coastline and the records of the lost ships named in Kane's logbook. Prior's Folly, as Thorne had christened it, was now simply the Prior Light, a place of significance, a landmark. Vesta found herself at the center of a quiet storm of attention. People who had once looked through her now tipped their hats. The storekeeper offered her unlimited credit. Jebediah Stone came to visit, a rare, wide smile on his face. He looked around the clean, spare room, at the small pot of beans simmering on a proper cast-iron stove she had bought. "I knew you were made of strong stuff, Vesta," he said, "but I didn't know you were a dragon slayer, too." He refused to take back Atlas or the wagon. "They belong here now," he said, "with you." With Mr. Abernathy's help, Vesta navigated the legal complexities of her find. The logbook was turned over to the State Historical Society, a priceless and terrible artifact. A portion of the gold was used to pay the back taxes on the property, officially and forever securing her deed. Another portion went to establish a fund for the descendants of the families whose ships had been lost, a task the historians took on with grim dedication. The rest, a fortune beyond her wildest imaginings, was hers. But Vesta had little interest in the wealth itself. She had found something far more valuable in the tower, a purpose. She used the money not for silks or carriages, but for stone and timber and glass. She hired a crew of masons, led by a man who had once apprenticed with her father, to repair the tower. They repointed the stone, patched the roof, and most importantly, installed new thick glass panes in the lamp room, sealing it against the wind for the first time in half a century. She did not want a great lens. She did not want to mimic the lie of the past. The tower's life as a coastal beacon was over. Its new life was just beginning. She watched the men work, her quiet presence a constant guide. She specified that the hidden chamber be left as it was, sealed behind a new wooden door, a silent museum to the tower's dark past. The townspeople would sometimes ride out to the point to watch the work, speaking in low voices about the girl who had turned a ruin into a landmark, a curse into a legacy. She was no longer an outcast. She was the keeper. The work was finished by autumn. The air grew crisp, and the late afternoon sun bathed the coast in a soft, golden light. Jeb came out one evening, bringing a parcel from town. He found Vesta standing on the promontory, her hand resting on Atlas's broad neck, looking at the restored lighthouse. It stood proud and whole against the darkening sky, its white stone almost luminous. It was no longer a tombstone. It was a monument to endurance. The grounds around it were clean, and a small, sturdy outbuilding had been constructed to serve as a stable and storage shed. A simple wooden sign had been placed at the start of the path, carved by Jeb himself. It read simply, "The Prior Light. Traveler's Shelter." "It's done," Jeb said, standing beside her. "You did it, Vesta." "We did it," she corrected him quietly. Inside, the ground floor was warm and welcoming. There were several simple cots, a large table, and a well-stocked pantry. It was a hostel, a safe harbor for anyone caught on the road, free of charge, supported by the fund she had established. Her own small private quarters were on the floor above. As dusk settled, Vesta climbed the spiral stairs one last time. The lamp room was clean and quiet, the new glass reflecting the amber and violet hues of the sunset. In the center of the room, on the old iron pedestal, sat a single large oil lantern, its brass polished to a high shine. She lit the wick, a warm, steady, honest light filled the room, pushing back the shadows. It wasn't a beacon for ships miles out at sea. It was a light of welcome, a promise of safety for anyone who might be near. It was the light she had shown the Miller family. Jeb joined her, looking out at the vast, peaceful landscape. "Funny," he said. "Everyone called this a lighthouse, but it never really was. Not a true one. It was just a trap. What do you call it now?" Vesta looked at the simple, unwavering flame of her lantern. She thought of the cold, dusty girl who had arrived here with nothing, and the dark history she had unearthed. She thought of the family she had sheltered from the storm. A small, peaceful smile touched her lips. "I call it a lighthouse," she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet room. "I think it's the first time it's ever truly been one. Thank you for staying with us to the end of Vesta's remarkable journey. Her story is a powerful reminder of the power of tending the right kind of light, and how true value is often hidden in the places and people the world has cast aside. If you were moved by her story, please give this video a like, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of hidden history and quiet courage. We'll see you next time.